Back in the Dark Ages, when I was young, ambitious, and foolish, I had dreams of doing big things in a big way. So let me set the scene. I was in college taking my first course in television production, and one of the first assignments was coming up with a short segment for a TV show. The idea was to give us students our first taste of taping a live TV show in the studio, using all the resources at our command like lighting, set design, audio, and on-camera talent and performers. And each of us would direct our own production, calling the shots from the control room. Now, many of my classmates chose a very simple concept, like take one single musician, sit him or her on a stool, have them strum the guitar, and sing a short song. Quite easy. So easy, in fact, it probably guaranteed an A grade, because what could go wrong with something like that? Just put a single microphone on the performer, aim a few lights at them, set up the studio cameras for close-ups and medium shots, roll the tape, and you're done. You didn't even need to do any fancy set design or backgrounds. A plain black curtain would do fine. So that was what many students chose. But not me. As I said, I was young and foolish. I had bigger things in mind. So I set out to do a Hollywood-style game show. What was I thinking? Now, mind you, this was back in the 1970s, so television technology was still rather primitive compared to what we have today. We didn't have all the fancy lighting, special effects, and expensive sound stages yet in our tiny little college studio. We didn't even work with color TV. In my college, we were still shooting in black and white, using antique cameras. Like I said, it was the Dark Ages. So I began my project with all due excitement, casting fellow students for the role of host and contestants. I pre-recorded an upbeat musical introduction with an over-the-top announcer, drew up a set design featuring the name of the game show in big, bold letters, obtained sound effects like a buzzer for the contestants. And then, of course, I sat down to do the scripting, including coming up with all the questions and answers for the game. It was a pretty complicated production, and I thought I had everything covered. Well, not quite. Here's where the story gets interesting. It was production day. After the other students did their musical performances on stools, it was time for my big-time game show. As soon as they were all finished, I put on my set designer hat and carefully rearranged the background, podium, and other essential paraphernalia. I chatted briefly with a classmate who would be handling the audio, giving them the cues, the musical intro, the buzzer sound effects, and other essentials. Then we made sure everyone had microphones and the lighting was just right. Well, as it turned out, the show was so complex to set up that we totally overshot the time allotted for the rehearsal. Basically, we had no rehearsal. We went right into the recording session. And it was then that I discovered the biggest flaw in the whole production. And that was, essentially, that I was no director. If you ever watch TV game shows or television news programs for that matter, you know there's a lot happening on camera. But what you don't see is that there's even more going on behind the scenes to make it all come off so professionally. And the director is usually the one who ties it all together. He or she is the one watching dozens of TV screens in the dark and making split-second decisions, instructing the control room crew on things like when to cue the announcer, which camera to switch to for a close-up, when the music or sound effects need to be played, etc., 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 etc. And believe me, there are so many etceteras it would boggle your mind. Do you know that scene in The Exorcist where the little girl's head turns around 360 degrees? Well, that's about what you need to be a TV director. I did not have that kind of multi-track mind, I can assure you. To this day, I think I had some sort of attention deficit disorder that translated to disaster in the control room. Well, it began. We started rolling the tape. The show began, and I immediately froze like a deer in headlights. All the decisions that had to be made, all the choices on which camera to switch to, they were all just one big blur. Obviously, not having any rehearsal was a big factor in this, and the sheer complexity of it all was another issue. But more than anything else, I think I was having an out-of-body experience. My body was definitely not in that control room. Needless to say, the TV game show went down in flames, and I resolved to never again sit in the director's chair for the rest of my broadcasting career. But as fate would have it, just 3 years later at the TV station I was then working as a producer, the assigned director came in late that one day, and I had to fill in on a moment's notice. Oh no, the nightmare begins all over again. Now, why am I telling you this story now? Well, looking back at the past year of pandemic, politics, and pillaging, the 3 Ps, I think there's something to be said for putting things in perspective. First of all, a giant asteroid didn't crash into Earth, wiping out all life on the planet. Second, our democracy did not descend into anarchy or dictatorship. Third, with more and more people getting vaccinated every day, the pandemic may soon be on its way out, providing that people continue to follow the rules and don't let down their guard. And fourth, and most important, here's another P word, the principles of Unitarian Universalism are still as relevant as ever. We still believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person. That means everyone. Every culture, every gender, every race, every marital status or relationship preference, every physical condition or medical concern, every differently abled person, every political persuasion, and every religious belief that contributes to the betterment of humanity. And we're also on a constant quest for justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. And behind that all is the belief that love guides us in everything we do. Without love, we are nothing more than rocks and stones on a cold, lifeless planet. Every day we strive for greater acceptance of one another while encouraging spiritual growth in our churches and congregations. And after this past year, we know that accepting each other is not an easy task. Coming back together again after 4 years and more of divisiveness, hatred, and conflict, especially when it was instigated and egged on by the very top levels of our government, is truly going to be a challenge for the ages. Truth be told, our so-called United States never fully recovered from the Civil War 156 years ago. So this current situation of ours is not new. It's only now being brought back into the open for us to finally solve once and for all. And through our continued spiritual growth, asking the questions, dealing with disagreements, and being open to change and new ideas, we may ultimately bring about that more perfect union that we've all been striving for such a long, long time. As Unitarian Universalists, we also believe in a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, which includes science, philosophy, religion, art, literature, poetry, mass media, and even the less tangible fields of meditation, earth-centered traditions, the lessons of nature, and yet to be explored new discoveries and dimensions of human and artificial intelligence. For it is only by opening our hearts and minds and souls to all the infinite possibilities of knowledge and spiritual health can we ever embrace our full, total humanity. We also stand for the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. And even as democracy has been sorely tested in the past year in our own country as never before, we still lift it up as perhaps one of the most viable methods of governance and human relations that modern civilization has ever seen. And with that in mind, we work towards the goal of world community, with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Now that means knocking down walls, opening up borders, seeking common interests instead of dwelling on differences, and thinking outside the boxes we've all been trapped in for centuries upon centuries. And the seventh and last item in our list of Unitarian Universalist principles, we maintain respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are but one small part. So how does that relate to the television control room I described earlier? Well, it's sort of like the interdependent web. So much of what happens in a TV production depends on a unique combination of people, facilities, time, and money. And they're all interdependent. As I found out years ago, if you're trying to get a TV show up and running and the time runs out, you're either going to have to pay more money or book additional studio time or have your crew work overtime or be satisfied with a lesser quality production. But it also goes well beyond that. What's the second word in television control room? Control. It's all about control. And one thing we definitely seem to have lost in this past year of pandemic is the notion of control, no matter how false or imaginary that may really be. You see, we human beings like to think that we're in control. Sure, on a day-to-day basis, we may have some limited control over our schedules, what we eat, who we hang out with, what activities occupy our time. But do we really? If just one thing changes in a typical day, it can all go to heck in a handbasket very quickly. There's even a whole movie about that very premise. In the film Clockwise, British comedian John Cleese showed us the hilarious results of what happens when a schedule gets thrown off. So when the pandemic hit, just about a year ago now, everyone's schedules got thrown in the dumper. To call it a dumpster fire would be too kind. Along with it, a lot of other things went haywire also. Peace, liberty, and justice for all were tested like never before. They're still with us today, thankfully, but we may never look at them again in the same way. And we certainly can't take them for granted anymore. We have to work for them every single day of our lives. Our fourth principle of truth and meaning also suffered some collateral damage, and we're still not done fighting that battle. The thing to remember is, you can try to control what people believe is the truth, but sooner or later, the real truth will come out. That's one of the most important things about our democracy. Unlike a totalitarian dictatorship where facts get twisted and distorted and lies are the only certainty, our country has tried to live by the rule of law and the search for truth and meaning, just like our Unitarian Universalist denomination does. And what's more, we embrace the truths from many different parts of the world. Take the teachings of Buddha, for example. In one of the readings found in our UU hymnal, we're told, "Let us overcome the liar by truth." In the same reading we hear, "Never does hatred cease by hating in return. Only through love can hatred come to an end." And also, "Let us overcome violence by gentleness. Let us overcome evil by good." Principles like these are what have kept us going through the dark days of the past year. And they will continue to be the light which guides our way in the months ahead. They're like a spotlight in the TV studio, focusing attention on what's really important in the ongoing drama of our existence. The other parallel that comes to mind in the comparison between our UU tradition and a TV control room is the element of people. The Dalai Lama of Tibet once said, "When I meet people, I just think of myself as another human being. I don't think about being a Buddhist, a Tibetan, or the Dalai Lama, just a human being. I find it's easier to make friends that way. And I find that a smile is a true expression of friendship. Of course, when it comes down to the very basics, it's people who make up our churches. And that's the key point I want to leave you with today. Just as in a TV control room, there are a variety of people who make up any organization. In a TV studio, you have people with different talents and skills like engineers, lighting experts, set designers, audio specialists, producers, directors, performers, writers, and journalists. And in a congregation, you have musicians, board members, caregivers, pastors and preachers, people who care for the building, people who operate the sound system, people who volunteer their time, energy, and resources in social justice programs, people who set up coffee hour, educators, artists, people who handle the financial part of keeping a church afloat, and last but not least, the people in the congregation who by their presence each Sunday form an invisible bond that provides a spiritual glue that makes a church and unlike any other organization. We each have different interests and skills, and not everyone can do somebody else's job. I learned that a long time ago when it came to television production. But I also discovered I had other talents just as important that could be used for the greater good of the organization. And here's something else that's critical to our existence. We all need one another. By coming together as we do, whether in person or virtually, we actually magnify and multiply each other's presence. We reinforce our common humanity, and in doing so provide the seeds that ultimately turn into something even greater than ourselves. As we have often been told, it takes a village to raise a child. And likewise, it takes a village, or more accurately, a whole church, or even a collection of denominations and different faith traditions to change our lives for the better. That's the big picture, my friends. That's the blockbuster movie that moves the world. But if this all seems too overwhelming to you, let's just take one step back and remember the example of Mother Teresa, whom I once quoted over a year ago. With all the needs, all the sickness and suffering, all the poverty she encountered on a daily basis in her native country of India, one could wonder how in the world she ever managed to accomplish anything at all in her ministry. How did she keep her own head above water? When someone asked how she did it, she replied very modestly, "I just focus on one person at a time." One person at a time. One day at a time. Sounds like some very wise advice to me. I probably could have used that advice a long time ago when I was sitting in the director's chair in that control room. Just focus on one screen at a time. Don't get distracted by all the dozens of other things happening all around you. You do have other people on your team helping you. And together, you'll do what you need to do to succeed. And we can easily apply that same wisdom to our own situation today, in this great land stretching from ocean to ocean. Don't let the politics, pandemic, and pillaging get you down. Stay with the principles. Cherish the people around you, and love one another. Love will get us through. Amen.